As I crossed the double oak doors of that sumptuous hall, her venomous words cut through the air and reached my ears with a crystalline clarity that chilled me to the bone. Isabella Blackwood, the seemingly impeccable fiancée my brother had chosen as his future wife, was strategically positioned near the champagne fountain, leaning conspiratorially toward her carefully selected group of bridesmaids. Each of these women held a delicately crafted crystal flute filled with golden French champagne, their perfectly manicured fingers adorned with expensive rings that captured and reflected the light from the enormous crystal chandeliers suspended majestically from the vaulted ceiling. Isabella's calculated whisper was purposefully modulated to carry across the expanse of polished marble in the hall, and I knew with absolute certainty that she intended it that way. "Look what just dragged itself from the depths of the countryside to join our sophisticated gathering," she murmured with rehearsed disdain, her voice laced with poorly disguised venom. Her carefully chosen companions immediately erupted into perfectly orchestrated laughter, their giggles echoing like a chorus of well-dressed hyenas in designer gowns that probably cost more than most people earn in several months of hard work. Isabella didn't even deign to give me a direct glance as she delivered her calculated insult for maximum emotional impact. To her refined sensibilities and inflated sense of superiority, I was completely invisible, utterly insignificant. Nothing more than an unwanted embarrassment that had somehow managed to crawl out of rural obscurity to tarnish the pristine aesthetic of her absolutely impeccable engagement celebration. What Isabella Blackwood could never have imagined, not even in her wildest dreams, what no living soul in that luxuriously decorated hall could have even considered as a remote possibility, was that I had personally signed the purchase contract and acquired the deed to this exact establishment exactly 3 years, 4 months, and 22 days ago. The Grand Golden Palace, in all its impressive magnificence, belonged entirely and completely to me. Every sparkling chandelier suspended majestically above her perfectly coiffed head, every piece of imported silverware she was delicately using to sample the gourmet canapés, every square inch of hand-selected Italian marble beneath her ridiculously expensive designer shoes was my property, bought with money I had earned through years of relentless work and strategic business decisions that few could imagine. And by the time this night reached its inevitable and dramatic conclusion, that careless and cruel whisper would systematically destroy everything she had ever desired, dreamed of, or schemed to obtain through her manipulative machinations. My name is Sophia Winters, and I am currently 31 years old, having spent the first 18 years of my existence in the microscopic rural community of Cedar Valley, in the state of Montana. This was a town so impossibly and absurdly small and insignificant that our most memorable traffic disruption in recorded history occurred when old Farmer Thompson's prize, Angus cattle, managed to break through their barbed wire fences and proceeded to completely block Main Street for exactly 4 hours and 15 minutes. The entire incident became the talk of the town for months on end, which should give a pretty clear indication of how absolutely nothing ever happened in Cedar Valley. I made the life-changing decision to leave my childhood home immediately after turning 18, and I can honestly say that I've never really looked back or experienced even a single moment of genuine regret about that courageous choice. This wasn't because I harbored any deep hatred or resentment toward my geographical origins or the people who still live there, but rather because the members of my immediate family had made it abundantly and painfully clear through their words, actions, and countless small cruelties that there simply wasn't room for someone like me in their carefully constructed vision of what their family should represent. You see, I have an older brother named Alexander, who has always been and continues to be the golden child, the precious son who apparently couldn't do anything wrong in anyone's estimation, especially our parents. Throughout our entire childhood and adolescence, every accomplishment I managed to achieve, every goal I reached, every small victory I celebrated was immediately and inevitably measured against his supposedly superior achievements. Without fail, I consistently fell short in those cruel comparisons, no matter how hard I tried or how much effort I dedicated. If I managed to earn an A on a particularly challenging exam, Alexander had somehow secured an A+ on an even more difficult test. If I made the softball team after weeks of grueling practice, Alexander had not only made his team, but had been elected captain by his peers. If I won a small scholarship for academic performance, Alexander had already received a full-ride scholarship to his preferred university. The pattern was relentless, exhausting, and soul-crushing. My mother, Dorothy Winters, had a particularly devastating way of looking at me that consistently made me feel like nothing more than a rough preliminary sketch, while Alexander represented the finished masterpiece she could proudly display to her friends and neighbors. Her eyes would glaze over with disappointment whenever she looked in my direction, as if she were constantly wondering where she had gone wrong in raising me and why I couldn't be more like my perfect older brother. So I made the difficult but necessary decision to leave it all behind and start a new life. I carefully packed a single worn suitcase with my most essential belongings, bought a one-way bus ticket to the nearest major city with my last savings, and began my adult life completely from scratch with absolutely nothing except exactly $250 in crumpled bills, a head full of ambitious dreams, and an unbreakable, stubborn refusal to fail or give up, no matter what obstacles life might throw in my path. Everyone back in Cedar Valley, from my parents to my former classmates to the neighbors who had watched me grow up, assumed I was desperately struggling to survive in the big city. They probably imagined me living in some cramped, cockroach-infested studio apartment, subsisting on nothing but instant ramen and tap water, barely scraping together enough money to pay the rent each month. And to be completely honest, their mental image was remarkably accurate for approximately the first 2 years of my urban adventure, which were some of the most challenging and humbling years of my entire life. But what none of them knew, what they never bothered to ask or investigate, was that I had managed to secure employment as a member of the cleaning staff at an upscale boutique hotel in the city center. That seemingly humble position, which many people would have considered beneath them, or temporary at best, completely and utterly transformed my entire existence in ways I could never have imagined when I first applied for the job. I made it my mission to absorb absolutely everything around me like a sponge. I observed carefully. I studied intensely. I asked questions. I volunteered for extra shifts. I watched how the front desk staff interacted with guests, how management handled difficult situations, how the entire operation ran like a perfect machine. I systematically worked my way up through the ranks, from cleaning rooms to working the front desk, to assistant manager to full manager. Each promotion earned through dedication, competence, and an unyielding work ethic that impressed even the most demanding supervisors. Throughout this transformative period, I saved every penny I could, living on the absolute minimum while investing my money carefully and intelligently. I made smart financial decisions, educated myself about real estate and business opportunities, and took calculated risks when they seemed right, and the potential rewards justified the dangers. By the time I turned 28, I had saved enough money to purchase my first property, a small but profitable inn in an up-and-coming neighborhood. By 30, I had expanded my portfolio to include 4 separate properties across the region. Now, at 31, I operate Golden Hospitality Holdings, a thriving corporation that owns and manages 8 strategically located boutique hotels throughout the American West. The Grand Golden Palace serves as my flagship property, my greatest pride and joy, and the crown jewel of everything I've built through years of hard work and sacrifice. But here's the most important lesson you learn about building something meaningful and substantial from absolutely nothing, something that most people never understand until they've experienced it for themselves. You discover the incredible, almost mystical power that comes from staying quiet about your accomplishments and successes. You realize that when people consistently underestimate your capabilities, your intelligence, and your potential, that underestimation becomes your most powerful and effective weapon. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone who looks down on you is simply let them continue believing they're superior, while you silently outpace them in every meaningful way. So I made the conscious and deliberate decision never to inform my family about my financial and professional success. The truth is, they never asked anyway, never showed the slightest curiosity about what I was doing or how I was surviving in the real world. To them, I remained forever frozen in time, as the struggling little sister who couldn't measure up to Alexander and his thoroughly mediocre achievements in his mid-level management position at a small-town insurance company. The irony of the situation was so thick and layered that you could have spread it on toast and served it for breakfast. Tonight, an elaborately designed invitation had arrived for Alexander's engagement celebration, delivered at the last possible minute, which was undoubtedly my mother's guilty idea, so she could honestly tell her circle of friends and neighbors that the entire family had attended and shown their support. I had almost decided not to come, almost thrown the invitation straight into the trash, but something inexplicable drew me here tonight. Maybe it was simple curiosity about how my family's life had evolved, Maybe it was some small, stubborn hope buried deep in my heart that things had somehow changed for the better, that they had grown and matured, and might finally be ready to see me for who I really was. They hadn't changed one bit. I stood in the grand entrance of my own hotel, dressed casually in well-fitted jeans and my favorite pair of comfortable leather boots, my hair still carrying those faint but unmistakable traces of country air because I had deliberately driven through Cedar Valley on my way here, just to remind myself of where I had come from and how far I had traveled. My outfit, though it appeared simple and unpretentious to the casual observer, had actually cost more than Isabella's entire designer ensemble combined, but you wouldn't know that by looking at it. That's the fundamental difference between real money and fake money. Authentic wealth doesn't need to scream for attention or validation. And if I'm being completely honest, you can take the girl out of the farm, but the essence of the farm, the values and work ethic and connection to something real and authentic, will always remain embedded in the girl's soul. Though you can definitely take the hard-earned profits of the farm girl and deposit them directly into multiple high-yield investment accounts at the country's most prestigious banks. I scanned the luxuriously decorated hall and spotted my mother positioned on the other side of the marble expanse, holding court with a carefully selected group of her longtime friends and acquaintances. She was probably regaling them with elaborate stories about Alexander's wonderful and sophisticated fiancé and their bright and promising future together, painting a picture of family success and social climbing that bore little resemblance to reality. Alexander stood obediently beside Isabella, looking for all the world like a man who had won the lottery, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actually holding a worthless counterfeit ticket that would soon be exposed as fraudulent. Isabella finally deigned to glance in my direction, her smile sharp and cutting like a finely honed blade, designed to wound rather than welcome. She didn't recognize me as anything more than an inconvenience, a visible blemish on her perfectly orchestrated evening, an unwanted reminder that not everyone present belonged to her carefully curated social circle. That was perfectly fine with me. In fact, it was ideal. Let her continue thinking I was no one special. Let all of them maintain their comfortable illusions and superiority complexes for a little while longer. I had learned many years ago that the most effective revenge isn't loud, dramatic, or immediately obvious. True revenge is patient, methodical, and calculated. It's silently watching people dig their own graves with their words and actions, while they're too busy looking down on you to notice the metaphorical shovel in their perfectly manicured hands. So I returned Isabella's condescending smile with one of my own, walked with confident purpose to the elegant mahogany bar, and ordered a top-shelf drink. My carefully trained staff, who had been specifically instructed earlier, knew not to recognize me as anything more than another guest. Marcus Webb, my exceptionally competent general manager, caught my eye from across the crowded hall and gave me a subtle, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. Everything was running smoothly, and according to plan. Everything was absolutely perfect at the moment, because in approximately 3 hours, Isabella Blackwood was going to learn a very important and life-changing lesson that would stay with her for the rest of her existence. Never, under any circumstances, underestimate the country girl, especially when she happens to own every square inch of the ground you're currently treading on with such arrogant confidence. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please hit the subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I see every comment, and it means the world to me. Thank you so much for your support. Now, back to the story. The engagement celebration was precisely what any reasonable person would expect from someone with Isabella's particular combination of questionable taste and unlimited access to other people's money. The entire event was extravagant to the point of absurdity, over the top in every conceivable way, meticulously designed and orchestrated to impress people who were already thoroughly impressed with themselves and their perceived importance in the social hierarchy. The ballroom had been transformed into what could only be described as a fever dream of a winter wonderland. There were elaborate ice sculptures carved with incredible precision into the form of graceful swans, each one representing hours of skilled artistic labor, and costing more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. A champagne fountain dominated the center of the hall, cascading expensive French champagne in a continuous and wasteful display that seemed excessive and ridiculous even by the notoriously high standards of champagne fountain extravagance. The floral arrangements were so numerous and elaborate that they could have made a world-class botanical garden curator weep with envy. each bouquet carefully selected for maximum visual impact and minimal consideration for cost. My hotel staff, to their eternal credit, had performed absolutely magnificently in executing Isabella's vision, which filled me with genuine pride and satisfaction, even if I caught myself wanting to dramatically roll my eyes at every design choice Isabella had insisted upon during the planning process. I grabbed my perfectly crafted cocktail and strategically positioned myself in a quiet corner where I could observe the proceedings without being easily noticed or bothered by other guests. That's when my mother decided to seek me out, apparently having noticed my presence and feeling compelled to address it immediately. Dorothy Winters approached me with measured steps and the facial expression of a woman who had detected something distinctly unpleasant in the air and was methodically trying to locate the exact source of the offensive odor. She subjected me to a full head-to-toe visual inspection, her critical eyes pausing with obvious disapproval on my choice of comfortable leather boots, as if my footwear represented some kind of personal insult to her sensibilities and social position. "Well, I suppose it's good that you managed to make it here tonight," she said, her tone carefully modulated to suggest that my presence was anything but good and was, in fact, somewhat inconvenient and potentially embarrassing. "But I have to ask, dear, why couldn't you make the effort to wear something more appropriate for such an elegant occasion? You do realize that Isabella's family is very refined, very sophisticated, very particular about appearances." She emphasized the word refined, as if it were an advanced vocabulary term that I should carefully study and memorize, perhaps with flashcards and repeated practice sessions. I responded truthfully that I had come straight from work and hadn't had the opportunity to change into something more formal, which was completely accurate. I simply chose not to mention that work in my case meant running and managing a multi-million-dollar hospitality empire spanning 8 states. My mother let out one of her signature sighs, the same disappointed exhalation I'd heard my entire life, as if I were a constant source of disappointment that she had gradually learned to tolerate through years of practice and resignation. "Well, please at least try to make a good impression on the Blackwoods while you're here," she instructed with weary patience, before disappearing back into the crowd to resume her important social obligations and networking opportunities. And there it was, exposed in all its painful clarity. 20 seconds of forced conversation, and I was immediately transported back to feeling like I was 12 years old again, desperately trying and failing to meet some invisible and constantly shifting standard that no one had ever bothered to explain or help me understand. I turned my attention to observing Isabella as she moved through the hall like a social butterfly with a carefully calculated flight plan. The woman had air-kissed more cheeks tonight than a seasoned politician working a county fair during election season. Every gesture was precisely calculated for maximum effect, every smile carefully measured and deployed for optimal social impact, every conversation strategically chosen to advance her position in the complex social hierarchy she was determined to climb. Her parents, Richard and Evelyn Blackwood, positioned themselves nearby like proud peacocks displaying their magnificent plumage, watching their supposedly precious daughter work the room with practiced efficiency and obvious pride. Richard was a large and imposing man with a ruddy complexion, and the kind of overwhelming confidence that could derive from genuine hard-earned success or exceptionally skillful acting abilities. Evelyn was elegantly slender and impeccably polished, absolutely dripping with expensive jewelry that caught and reflected the light with every calculated movement she made. They certainly looked rich, acted rich, and spoke with the refined accents of people accustomed to the finer things in life. But something about their overall presentation seemed distinctly off to my trained eye, like viewing a beautiful and expensive painting that had been hung just slightly crooked on the wall. I couldn't quite put my finger on exactly what was bothering me about them yet, but I had learned to trust my business instincts, and those same instincts were sending warning signals about the Blackwood family. Alexander finally noticed my presence in the hall and made his way over to where I was standing, navigating the crowd with the easy confidence of the guest of honor. My older brother, 3 years my senior, still had that particular way of looking at me that made me feel like his annoying little sister who had persistently tagged along when we were kids, always trying to insert myself into his activities and social circles where I clearly didn't belong. "Hey, I'm really glad you could make it tonight," he said, though his tone and body language suggested he hadn't really noticed whether I was present or absent until this exact moment. "Have you had a chance to meet Isabella yet? She's absolutely amazing, Sophie. I mean, she's just everything I've ever wanted in a partner. I told him truthfully that I had seen her from across the hall, but I kept my more detailed opinions and observations to myself, knowing that sharing them would only cause unnecessary conflict and drama. Alexander nodded distractedly, his attention already wandering as he scanned the hall to identify who else he needed to greet and schmooze during the evening. Some things never change, apparently. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten with sudden and unexpected apprehension. He casually mentioned that our mother had given Isabella Grandma's necklace as an engagement gift. Wasn't that generous of her? He said with a genuine smile. Isabella absolutely loved it. I mean, she said it was exactly the kind of vintage jewelry she's always dreamed of wearing. I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. Grandma's necklace, the antique pendant that our grandmother had specifically promised to me before she died. She had held my hand with her frail and trembling hands and told me it was for me because I was her dreamer, her fighter, the one who would make something of herself against all odds. My mother knew this. She had been in the room when Grandma said it, her words clear and unequivocal, and she had given it to Isabella anyway, as if my memories and emotional connection to our deceased matriarch meant absolutely nothing. I looked across the hall and saw it. There it was, hanging gracefully around Isabella's neck as if it belonged there by right. My grandmother's necklace, my inheritance, my most precious memory, sparkling under the chandelier lights, as Isabella laughed at something someone had said, completely oblivious to the emotional significance of the jewelry she was displaying so casually. The DJ turned up the music so loud that I could feel my teeth vibrating in uncomfortable harmony. If I wanted my ears acoustically assaulted, I would have just gone to a construction site. At least there I'd get paid for the traumatic auditory experience. I excused myself from Alexander and made my way to the bathroom, needing a moment to breathe and process the wave of emotions washing over me like a tide. That's when I passed Richard Blackwood in the hallway, his phone pressed to his ear, his face tense with stress that was palpable even from a distance. He didn't see me. He was too focused on his conversation to notice my presence. I heard him say they needed this wedding to happen, that the Winters family had enough money to cover their current situation. He paused, listening to whoever was on the other end of the line. Then he said they just needed to get through the ceremony, and after that, everything would work out the way they had planned. He hung up and walked back toward the party, his salesman's smile sliding back into place like a professional mask he had practiced for years. I stood frozen in that hallway, my grandmother's necklace temporarily forgotten, replaced by something far more urgent and potentially dangerous. The Winters family had money. What money? My parents had a decent house, sure, but I knew there was a second mortgage on it because I'd been secretly paying it for 4 years. Alexander had a decent job. Nothing spectacular or particularly lucrative. There was no hidden family fortune anywhere. So why did Richard Blackwood think there was? And more importantly, what exactly was their situation that needed financial cover? I spent the next hour watching the Blackwoods like a hawk watches its prey. Every smile, every handshake, every perfectly timed laugh. Now that I knew something was wrong, I could see the cracks in their carefully orchestrated performance. Richard kept checking his phone obsessively, his jaw clenching every time he read a message. Evelyn's jewelry was impressive, but I noticed she kept touching it nervously, as if afraid it might disappear. And Isabella, beautiful and perfect Isabella, had a hunger in her eyes that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with poorly disguised desperation. I started piecing the puzzle together in my mind. The Blackwoods thought my family had money, but why? Then it hit me like a bolt of lightning. For the past 4 years, I'd been sending money to my parents anonymously through my company, Golden Hospitality Holdings. Every month, a payment would arrive to cover the mortgage, utility bills, medical expenses. When my dad had his knee surgery, I covered the bills without ever putting my name on it. I didn't want their gratitude or their prying questions. I just wanted to help from afar, quietly, and without acknowledgement. But my parents didn't know it was me. And apparently, my mother had decided it must be Alexander. Of course she did. In her mind, her golden child was secretly taking care of them, being the responsible and successful son she always knew he was. I could practically hear her bragging to her friends about how generous Alexander was, how he always looked after his family, the money I sent, the sacrifices I made, and Alexander got all the credit. The irony was so thick it could have walked into the party and ordered its own drink. So the Blackwoods did their research. They saw a nice house with no visible mortgage payments. They heard Dorothy bragging about her son's investments. They saw a family that appeared to have hidden wealth, and they targeted Alexander like sharks smelling blood in the water. But here's the problem with their plan. The money wasn't Alexander's. There was no family fortune. The Blackwoods were chasing a mirage. And when they discovered the truth, my family would be left with nothing but the fallout, unless someone stopped it. I found Marcus Webb near the service entrance, clipboard in hand, supervising the catering staff with his characteristic efficiency. He looked up when I approached, his professional mask sliding into genuine warmth when he saw it was me. He asked quietly if everything was okay, calling me Ms. Winters before I gave him a sharp look. He corrected himself and simply called me Sophia. I told him I needed a favor. I needed information on the Blackwood family. Anything he could find. Business records, news articles, anything that was out there. Marcus didn't ask why. That's what I appreciated about him. He simply nodded and said he'd see what he could dig up. He disappeared with his phone already in hand. I returned to the party trying to act normal, which was getting harder with every passing minute. That's when Isabella found me. She appeared at my side like a designer-clad ghost, her smile so sweet it could cause cavities. She suggested we should talk, just the two of us, to get to know each other better. She placed her hand on my arm as if we were old friends reuniting after years. I let her guide me toward a quiet corner near the restrooms. The moment we were out of earshot of the other guests, her smile vanished as if it had never existed. She told me she knew about me. She said she knew I sent money home every month, playing the good daughter from afar. But here's what confused her. She said, "Why would someone who could barely afford her own apartment send money to a family that didn't even like her?" I felt my jaw tighten but kept my expression neutral. She continued, "Unless," she said, "I was trying to buy their love, trying to prove I was worth something." Pathetic, really, she told me. She leaned closer and said I should know that Alexander had told her everything, how I'd always been jealous of him, how I couldn't handle not being the favorite, how the family only tolerated me out of pity. She smiled again, but this time, it was sharp and cruel. She said she was going to marry Alexander, become part of this family, and honestly, she thought it would be better for everyone if I just stayed away. She said no one would miss me. She called me deadweight, then patted my arm like she was consoling a child, and walked away. I stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. Isabella thought I was broke. She thought the money came from Alexander. She had no idea who I really was. It was like watching someone brag about how amazing their rental car is to the person who owns the entire dealership. Honestly, if arrogance burned calories, Isabella Blackwood would be invisible. Marcus appeared at my elbow, startling me from my thoughts. He handed me a folder and said I needed to see this. His face was pale, his usual composure shaken. He said, "The Blackwoods weren't just in debt. They were under investigation for fraud." I opened the folder right there in the hallway, scanning the documents inside. Financial records, court filings, news articles. The more I read, the colder I felt. The Blackwoods weren't who they claimed to be. Their real estate empire was a house of cards built on lies and other people's money. They were 6 months away from bankruptcy and federal investigation. This wedding wasn't about love. It was an escape plan. I took the folder to my car in the garage, needing privacy to process what I was reading. The overhead lights flickered, as if they were as shocked as I was. The documents painted an ugly picture. Richard and Evelyn Blackwood had been running what amounted to a Ponzi scheme for years. They collected money from investors for real estate developments that either didn't exist or were grossly overvalued. Early investors were paid with money from later investors, the classic con. But the house of cards was finally collapsing. Investigators were asking questions. Auditors were circling. Federal agents had opened a case. The Blackwoods needed an exit strategy, and fast. Enter my brother Alexander. I could see their logic, twisted as it was. Find a family that seemed to have money. Marry into it. Use the connection to prop up their crumbling reputation, or at the very least have somewhere to hide when it all came crashing down. They probably planned to drain whatever assets my family had before disappearing to start the con somewhere else. What they didn't realize was that my family had nothing. The house was mortgaged. Alexander's salary was average. The only money flowing into the Winters household came from me, and I could stop it with a single phone call. The Blackwoods were about to find out they'd targeted the wrong family, and when they did, they'd abandon Alexander faster than a sinking ship, leaving my brother heartbroken and my parents humiliated. Part of me wanted to let it happen. Let all of them suffer the consequences of their choices. My mother, who gave away my inheritance without a second thought. my brother who never once stood up for me. Let them feel what it's like to be discarded, ignored, set aside. But I couldn't do that. As much as they'd hurt me, they were still my family. Alexander was still the boy who taught me to ride a bike, even if he'd forgotten that somewhere along the way. My mother was still the woman who stayed up all night when I had chickenpox, even if she later decided I wasn't worth remembering. Family is complicated. You can love people and be furious with them at the same time. You can want to protect them even when they don't deserve it. So I made a decision. I was going to expose the Blackwoods. I was going to save my family from a disaster they didn't even know was coming, and I was going to do it my way. I called my lawyer first. Sarah Mitchell answered on the second ring despite it being 8 at night, which is why I paid her what I did. I gave her a rundown of the situation and asked how quickly she could verify the information in the folder. She said she'd have confirmation within an hour. Next, I called Patricia Hayes, a forensic accountant I'd worked with on a complicated acquisition 2 years ago. Patricia was a wizard with financial records, the kind of person who could look at a spreadsheet and tell you what someone had for breakfast. I sent her photos of the key documents and asked her to dig deeper. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take just a second to give it a like and leave a comment. It really helps me keep creating these stories for you, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Now, let's get back to Sophia. Patricia called back in 40 minutes. Her voice was tight with the excitement of someone who'd found something big. She told me I was right. They were running a Ponzi scheme, textbook stuff. But here's the interesting part. She said she'd cross-checked the Blackwood name in other states and found something in Nevada from 3 years ago. Same pattern, same scheme, different names. She said the fiancé's real name wasn't Isabella. She asked if I was ready for this. I said I was ready. Patricia told me the fiancé's real name was Iris Walsh. She said the parents weren't even her real parents. They were partners in a long-running con, and they'd been doing this for at least a decade. Different identities, different targets, same game. I sat in my car, the folder in my lap, and started laughing. I couldn't help it. These people had more identities than a Hollywood actress has ex-husbands. Iris, Isabella, probably planning to be Ivy next year. My phone buzzed with a message from Alexander. I stared at it for a long moment before opening it. He wanted to know if we could talk. He said something about Isabella felt off. I checked the time. 5 minutes to 9. When Richard Blackwood was scheduled to make his big welcome toast to the family. A little late. A little too late, big brother. You should have trusted that feeling an hour ago. You should have trusted me years ago. But better late than never. At least he was starting to see through the mask. I got out of the car and walked back toward the hotel. The night air was warm, and somewhere inside, a con artist in a white dress was about to have the worst night of her life. Time to crash an engagement party. I returned to the Grand Golden Palace with a different energy than when I'd left. Before, I was the invisible sister, the country girl everyone looked down on. Now, I was a woman with a plan. Marcus met me near the service entrance, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. He said he'd been watching the Blackwoods all night, and something was definitely off about them. He mentioned Richard had made 4 phone calls in the last hour, each one leaving him more agitated than the last. I told Marcus I needed the AV system ready. I said during Richard's toast at 9, we were going to give the guests a presentation they'd never forget. Marcus didn't even blink. He asked what kind of presentation we were talking about. I handed him a USB drive. On it were scanned copies of the most damning documents from the folder, plus everything Patricia had sent me. Court records from Nevada, financial statements showing the fraud, photos of Isabella from 3 years ago under her real name, Iris Walsh, a trail of lies stretching back a decade. I told him that when Richard started his toast, I wanted it all on the screens. Every document, every photo, every piece of evidence. Marcus took the drive with a faint smile. He said he'd always known working for me would be interesting, but this was something else entirely. Then he disappeared toward the control room. My phone buzzed. Sarah, my lawyer, confirming everything Patricia had found. The Blackwoods were indeed under federal investigation. More importantly, she'd called the lead investigator, a woman named Agent Diana Ross, who'd been trying to track down the Blackwoods for months. They kept moving, changing names, staying one step ahead until tonight. Sarah told me Agent Ross was already on her way with a team. They'd be outside the hotel by 9:15, ready to move in as soon as the evidence went public. Everything was falling into place. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait. I found a spot near the back of the hall where I could see everything without being noticed. Isabella was working the room again, that fake smile plastered on her face like it was painted there. Alexander was beside her, playing the devoted fiancé, completely unaware that his entire future was about to implode. My mother was near the front, chatting with Evelyn Blackwood like they were old friends. Two women who had nothing in common except their ability to make me feel worthless. Soon, one of them would realize she'd been conned. The other would realize she'd rejected the wrong daughter. I checked my watch. 8:52. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Alexander. He asked where I was and said he really needed to talk. He said something about the Blackwoods was bothering him. The way Richard kept disappearing. The way Isabella dodged every question about her past. He said maybe he was being paranoid. I looked at the message for a long moment. Part of me wanted to respond, tell him to trust his instincts, warn him about what was coming. But what would that accomplish? He'd had 34 years to trust me, include me, treat me like family. He'd chosen not to. Besides, if I warned him now, he might tip off Isabella, and I couldn't risk that. I typed back a simple response. I told him we'd talk after the toast, and to just hold on. 8:56. Richard Blackwood was straightening his tie near the small stage where the DJ had set up. He looked confident again, his salesman mask firmly in place. He had no idea what was about to happen. I thought about what Isabella had said to me earlier, how I was dead weight, how no one would miss me, how I should just stay away. The funny thing about people who underestimate you is they never see you coming. They're too busy looking down to miss the moment you rise up. 8:59. Richard stepped onto the stage and picked up the microphone. The DJ lowered the music. The guests turned to face him, champagne flutes in hand, ready to toast the happy couple. I made eye contact with Marcus across the hall. He gave me an almost imperceptible nod. The screens behind the stage flickered to life, currently showing a slideshow of Alexander and Isabella's photos. Happy couple at a restaurant, happy couple at the beach, happy couple living their happy lie. Not for much longer. Richard cleared his throat and began to speak. He said, "Good evening, everyone," and thanked them all for being there to celebrate this beautiful union. He said that when his daughter first brought Alexander home, he knew immediately that this young man was special. I almost laughed. His daughter. The daughter who wasn't his daughter. The daughter whose real name he probably had to remind himself of every morning. Richard continued talking about family, about legacy, about how honored the Blackwoods were to join the Winters family. He talked about bright futures and grandchildren and building something lasting together. Every word was a lie, and every lie was about to be exposed. Richard raised his glass. He said, "To the happy couple, to love, to family, forever." I picked up my phone and texted Marcus a single word. Now. The screens flickered. For a moment, everyone probably thought it was a technical glitch. Alexander and Isabella's happy photos vanished, replaced by something entirely different. A document, official-looking, stamped with court seals and legal terminology. Richard's smile froze on his face. The document was a Nevada court filing from 3 years ago, a fraud investigation. And there, listed as a person of interest, was a name no one in this hall had heard before. Iris Walsh. A murmur rippled through the crowd. People squinted at the screens, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Richard fumbled with the microphone, his face going from red to pale in seconds. He said, "There must be some mistake," and called it a technical error. He turned to the AV booth and shouted for someone to fix it. But the screens kept changing. Another document appeared. Financial records showing investor money being funneled into shell companies. Then another. News articles about a real estate scam in Las Vegas that cost dozens of families their life savings. Then photos. A younger Iris Walsh. Different hair color. Same cold eyes. Standing next to Richard and Evelyn at some charity event under completely different names. Isabella stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, her champagne flute trembling in her hand. For the first time all night, her mask had slipped completely. She looked terrified. Alexander stared at the screens, then at Isabella, then back at the screens. I could see his mind working, pieces clicking into place, the doubt he'd felt all night suddenly making horrible sense. Richard tried to push through the crowd toward the exit, but 2 of my security guards stepped into his path. Evelyn clutched his arm, whispering frantically, but there was nowhere to go. That's when I stepped forward. I walked through the parting crowd toward the stage, my boots clicking on the marble floor. Every eye in the hall turned to me. The country girl, the nobody, the dead weight. Marcus's voice came over the speakers, calm and professional. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce the owner of the Grand Golden Palace and CEO of Golden Hospitality Holdings, Please welcome Miss Sophia Winters." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's face went white. Alexander's jaw literally dropped. Even Isabella, in the midst of her panic, looked genuinely shocked. I took the microphone from Richard's limp hand. I said, "Good evening, everyone. I apologized for the interruption, but I thought they might want to know who they were really celebrating tonight." I gestured to the screens behind me. I said, "Richard and Evelyn Blackwood aren't who they claim to be. Their real estate empire was a fraud. Their wealth was stolen from innocent investors, and their daughter Isabella was actually named Iris Walsh, a con artist who'd been running the same scheme for over a decade." Isabella finally found her voice. She screamed that I was lying and called me a jealous, pathetic nobody. She said I was making this up because I couldn't stand to see Alexander happy. I smiled at her. I said, "That's interesting." And I asked if I'd also made up the federal investigation that had been following them for 2 years. I mentioned the arrest warrants issued last month in Nevada, and said I was curious how I could have faked the fact that Agent Diana Ross and her team were currently waiting outside this hotel. As if on cue, the hall doors opened. 4 people in suits walked in, badges visible, expressions utterly professional. Isabella's face crumbled. Richard tried to run. He made it about 10 feet before Agent Ross intercepted him with a calm but firm hand on his shoulder. She told him that Richard Blackwood, or whatever his real name was under arrest for wire fraud, investment fraud, and conspiracy. Evelyn started crying, mascara running down her carefully made-up face. She kept saying there was a mistake, that they could explain everything, that it wasn't what it looked like. Isabella, Iris, whatever her name was, turned to Alexander one last time. Her voice was desperate, pleading. She asked if he was really going to let his sister do this to them. She said they loved each other, and he had to believe her. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. I could see the war raging behind his eyes. The woman he thought he loved versus the evidence he couldn't deny. Then he did something I never expected. He stepped away from her. He said he didn't even know who she was. His voice was quiet, broken, but certain. He said he didn't know who any of them were. Isabella's expression shifted from desperation to rage in an instant. She lunged toward me, screaming that I'd ruined everything, that I was supposed to be nobody, that I was just the stinky country girl. Security caught her before she reached me. I leaned close enough for only her to hear. I said that this stinky country girl owned the hall she was standing in, paid the salaries of everyone about to escort her out, and would sleep very soundly tonight knowing exactly who she was. They led her away, still screaming, her designer dress rumpled, her perfect hair ruined, her entire carefully constructed life crumbling with every step. I turned back to the stunned crowd, most of whom were still trying to process what had just happened. I said, "Well, the catering's already paid for, and it seemed a shame to waste good food." I told them the bar would stay open for anyone who wanted to stick around. Nervous laughter rippled through the hall. The DJ, bless his heart, started playing something upbeat. The engagement party was over, but the night was just beginning. The next hour felt like something out of a fever dream. The Blackwoods, all 3 of them, were escorted out in handcuffs, while the remaining guests watched in stunned silence. Isabella, or Iris, or whoever she'd be in her next life, was still shouting threats as they put her in the back of an unmarked car. Something about lawyers, lawsuits, revenge, empty words from an empty person. She went from future Mrs. Winters to future inmate in under 15 minutes. That had to be some kind of record, even for a professional con artist. Inside the hall, the mood had shifted from shock to something else. Curiosity, maybe fascination. Some guests were already on their phones, probably sharing what had just happened with everyone they knew. By morning, this story would be all over town. Alexander found me near the bar. He looked like a man who'd just woken from a nightmare, only to realize he was still dreaming. His eyes were red, his hands shaking, his entire worldview clearly shattered. He asked how I knew. His voice cracked on the words. He asked how I found out. I told him I listened. I said I observed. I paid attention. All the things I'd been doing my entire life while everyone else ignored me. He went quiet for a moment. Then he said he was sorry. He said he knew that didn't cover it, that it didn't cover years of treating me like an afterthought. But he was sorry. I studied my brother's face, looking for the catch, the angle, but all I saw was genuine remorse, maybe for the first time. I told him sorry was a start. We stood there in silence, 2 siblings who'd spent decades as strangers, finally seeing each other clearly. Then my mother appeared. Dorothy Winters looked smaller somehow, as if the night's events had physically shrunk her. She approached slowly, uncertain, none of her usual confidence on display. She started to say she didn't know, but I cut her off. I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. Bank records, wire receipts, 4 years of payments to their mortgage company, their utility providers, their medical bills, all from Golden Hospitality Holdings, all from me. I told her she thought Alexander was supporting them. I said she bragged to everyone about her generous, successful son. I let that hang in the air for a moment before saying it was me. It was always me. My mother looked at the phone, then at me, then back at the phone. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. I said I didn't do it for thanks. I said I did it because they were my family, even when they made me feel like I wasn't theirs. But I thought she should know the truth about who was really there for her. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears. Not the dramatic, performative tears I'd seen her use at family events, but real ones, the kind that come from somewhere deep. She whispered my name, Sophia, like she was saying it for the first time. Before I could respond, there was a commotion near the dance floor. I turned to see my grandmother's necklace lying on the ground, where Isabella had thrown it during her meltdown. Alexander walked over and picked it up carefully, as if it might break. He looked at it for a long moment, then walked back to me. He said, "This was always supposed to be yours." His voice was thick with emotion. He said he didn't know Mom had given it away, and he was sorry. He placed the necklace in my hand. The weight of it felt right, like something that had been missing for years was finally back where it belonged. My mother watched the exchange with tears streaming down her face. She said she'd been so wrong about everything. I didn't disagree with her, but I didn't attack either. There would be time for hard conversations later. For now, I was just tired. A guest wandered over and asked if the party was still on, looking confused but hopeful. I looked around the hall. The ice sculptures were melting. The champagne fountain was still flowing. Half the guests had left, but the other half seemed determined to get their money's worth from the open bar. I shrugged and signaled the DJ to keep playing. Why not? The night had already been weird enough. What harm could a little dancing do? 3 weeks later, I sat in my office at the Grand Golden Palace, looking out at the city skyline. The morning sun was streaming through the windows, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The Blackwoods were done. Federal prosecutors had enough evidence to charge them with multiple counts of fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Iris Walsh, the woman who'd called me a stinky country girl, was in custody awaiting trial. Her bail had been set high enough that even her fake rich parents couldn't post it. Turns out, when you spend decades stealing from people, you don't have many friends willing to help when things go south. The story made the local news for about a week. Hotel magnate exposes con artists at family engagement party. One headline even called me the country girl who owned the hall. I had that one framed. It hangs in my office now, right where I can see it every morning. Alexander came to visit me at the hotel yesterday. It was the first time he'd seen my office, my staff, the life I'd built without anyone's help. He walked around touching things like he couldn't believe they were real. He said he'd spent years thinking he knew who I was. He said he'd been wrong about everything. I told him we both had a lot of years to make up for. I said, maybe we should start now. We went to lunch. A real lunch. Not a family obligation where we made small talk and avoided anything meaningful. We actually talked about our childhood, about our parents, about all the things we'd never said to each other. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was honest. That was more than we'd ever had before. My mother started therapy last week. She called to tell me, her voice small and uncertain, so different from the woman who used to make me feel like a constant disappointment. She said she wanted to understand why she'd treated me the way she did. She said she wanted to be better. I told her I appreciated that. I said we could take things slow, and we would. Rebuilding trust takes time, but at least we were finally building something instead of watching it crumble. This morning, I was hosting a business breakfast at the hotel restaurant. Investors, partners, people who wanted to discuss expansion opportunities, normal stuff for a normal day. A young woman walked in looking nervous. She was wearing simple clothes, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her eyes wide as she took in the elegant surroundings, clearly out of her element. One of my investors, a man named Gerald who had too much money and too little manners, made a comment loud enough for everyone to hear. He asked who let her in, and said it was a private event. I stood up from the table. I walked over to the young woman and extended my hand. I said her name warmly, calling her Jessica, and said I was so glad she could make it. I said, "Everyone, I want you to meet Jessica Martinez, this year's recipient of the Golden Hospitality Holdings Scholarship." I told them she grew up in a small town in Kentucky, worked 2 jobs to put herself through community college, and was about to start at Cornell's hotel management program in the fall. The room went quiet. Gerald suddenly found his coffee very interesting. I led Jessica to a seat at my table, the same table as the investors, the same table as the people who thought they were better than her because of their money and connections. She whispered a thank you to me, looking overwhelmed. I told her not to thank me yet. I said the real work was just beginning, but I told her that if she ever felt like she didn't belong somewhere, to remember that the people who build the most beautiful things usually started with nothing but stubbornness and dreams. She smiled at that. After the breakfast, I stood in the lobby of my hotel, watching guests come and go. Business people, tourists, families, all walking on floors I owned, sleeping in beds I paid for, completely oblivious to the woman who made it all possible. And that was fine. I didn't need them to know. People will always try to make you feel small because of where you came from. Let them. While they're busy looking down on you, they won't see you rising up. I learned that lesson a long time ago, back in a small town, where I was never good enough, never pretty enough, never enough of anything. I carried it with me through years of struggle and doubt, and people telling me I'd never amount to anything. And now here I was, standing in my hotel, surrounded by everything I'd built. The stinky country girl. She smelled success coming from a mile away,